In this section, we're going to start to write out our real test for the fetch top IDs function. So inside of here, I'm going to delete the kind of little test code or sample code we had previously, and then we'll immediately dive in by creating a new instance of the News API Provider class. So back over here inside my test, I'm going to say final News API is News API Provider. So then inside of here, we might try to directly call the fetch top IDs function and let that make a real request over to the Hacker News API. But quick thing I want to mention about that. Okay, so here's a diagram of what's happening inside of our API provider class right now. We've got fetch top IDs and fetch item, and they're both relying upon client.get to make a real request to the Hacker News API. Now the issue with this is that in a test environment, we generally prefer to not have our code make any requests to outside APIs. And there's two good reasons for this. On the first hand, or the first reason, anytime we make a network request, it takes some amount of time. And so if we have many tests inside of our project, we don't want to have to be waiting for a ton of these requests to make a lot of these tests to make a real request to some outside API. It just means it's going to take our tests longer to run. In addition, if this Hacker News API ever temporarily goes down, well then we'll be essentially in a state where we can't even run our tests because our tests will be trying to access that API that we cannot access. The other big reason that we don't like to allow our tests to make real HTTP requests is that we never quite know what data we're going to get back from this API. Today, it might be for fetch top IDs, and it might be a list of like the 50 top topics or the 50 top IDs. Tomorrow, it might be, for some reason, a list of 40 IDs. Maybe they changed their API. And so in general, we prefer not to reach out to real APIs when we are writing tests. So in order to still write an effective test, we're going to be making use of a package inside, or a submodule of the HTTP package that we looked at very briefly called the testing library. So inside my HTTP package documentation right here on the testing library page, and inside of here is a class called mock client. So this is why we had created an instance of client inside of our News API provider rather than directly using the get function as we did previously. So we created an instance of client right here and assign it to an instance variable on our News API provider. Now to test our code, we're going to take that instance of the client library that we just created, and we're going to instead replace it with an instance of the mock client. So this mock client is essentially a testing version of that client class. Whenever we make use of mock client, if we try to run some code that executes a request, the request never actually goes to some outside API. There's no actual network request completed. Instead, the mock client will essentially instantly complete the request for us. And so that makes it a perfect use case for writing out tests. It solves both the two issues that we were running into earlier. Number one, the request gets instantly completed, so it doesn't slow down our tests. Number two, you and I have the ability to control the data that gets returned from the mock client. So essentially what you and I are going to do inside of our News API provider test file right here, we're going to create a new instance of mock client, and we're going to say, hey, mock client, anytime someone tries to use you to make a request, just return this preset list of IDs. We'll then call fetch top IDs right here. The mock client will be used, so we're essentially going to, in the testing world, replace this little bit right here. The mock client is going to be used to make that request. The mock client is going to instantly return that JSON data that we specify, and then we're going to essentially test to make sure that fetch top IDs correctly parses that JSON data and returns the list back to us. So let's give this a shot. Back inside of my test file, I'm going to define a new instance of mock client. Now mock client is going to take a single argument. It's going to be a function, and this function gets invoked anytime our code tries to make a legitimate request. So in other words, when client.get back over here is executed, rather than making the real request, this function right here is going to be executed. And then whatever you and I return from this function is going to be returned from this request over here. So again, we're kind of short-circuiting this entire request process. Now this function itself gets called with an object that we refer to as the request object. And it has some information about the request that our code is trying to issue. And so the request object right here probably has some information about, say, maybe the URL that we are trying to make the request to. In our case, we don't really care about this request object too much. Now, if you wanted to, you absolutely could inspect this request object and make sure that a request is being issued to the URL that you would expect. That would be a totally viable expectation to write inside of a test, but not quite what we mean to do. Okay, we're running a little bit long here, so let's take a very brief pause. We're going to come back in the next section and fill out this mock client function.